Welcome back to the second in our series of what we're calling God's Story. And we started off our series last week in person. So if you want to go back and watch that on YouTube, you please take advantage of starting at the beginning. But we are on part 2 now. And I guess before we get going, we're calling this series God's Story for Dummies. And if you're familiar with the Dummies kind of books, I think the reason we kind of picked this is because those books give us kind of a working knowledge
That's right.
of a topic, enough to like have a conversation.
Yeah, it gives you you could actually be somewhat even knowledgeable. Yeah, nothing of an expert, but definitely knowledgeable. Where you can know what's going on.
Yeah, and it might give you enough even to get started on a
Yep,
particular hobby like photography or stamp collecting
absolutely.
or whatever, even video games, and lots of authors or books we can get information on through these.
That's right.
So I think those are that gives you an idea of what we're trying to accomplish in this theory in this
Hmm.
series. So I think the next thing we need to really kind of cover is what is God's story. So God's story is actually found in the Bible, and it goes in four main movements. So some people think of the Bible as a bunch of sort of random books that were kind of thrown together, and there's some narrative, and there's some history, and there's some poetry,
Yep.
and there's some laws and things, and it's hard to sometimes see how they're all connected, and that's really what this is all about, the overarching story. And it goes in four main movements. There's creation, which we covered last week's video, and then we're going to talk about the fall today, and for a couple of weeks actually, and then we're going to hit redemption, which was kind of throwback to Easter, but we'll hit that again when it's appropriate, and then finally the restoration. So those are kind of the four main movements of God's story.
That's right. And with the Jesus' life, death, and resurrection really being the pivotal point in that story of that with those four main movements.
Yeah, and I think that's key thing to remember is that
Yep.
the pivotal point in any story is where the story's decided. It's not finished,
Hmm.
and it's kind of the build up to that point, but at that particular point, whatever happens, the ending is decided. And that's what Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is. It's the pivotal part in God's story. But I think in order to understand how it's pivotal, we we can only understand that when we know the whole story.
That's right.
And then I think I really appreciate. We use the word gospel a lot in Christian circles and at church, and it literally means good news. But I think it's sometimes good to review like what makes news good news. And there's an excerpt from a book by N.T. Wright called "Simply Good News," and he states in there, for something to be good news, something has to have happened, so that something therefore will happen, usually a positive thing, and
Hmm.
that the way things are between what has happened and what will be different because we know what's going to happen.
Right.
And so I hope that is straight for everybody, and we'll relate that to the part. So right now we're kind of looking at the part of the story where we're setting the context, setting the idea of how Jesus is good news. So we started off with
Yeah.
creation last week. So just to kind of give a summary of the point of creation. Now, lots of times Christians like to argue over, you know, whether it's a literal 6 days or,
That's right.
and then atheists, why would anybody believe in intelligent design or that there is even a God? But we have to remember that the authors of this book were sort of giving a theological
That's
perspective
right.
of creation. And that really, theology is a discovery of the divine, or in our case, God. So
Hmm.
the purpose then is telling the story is to help us understand why God created the earth and humans, not how or when.
That's right. And I think that's the big thing to remember. It is really pointing to that there is a creator, and it's about the creator
Yep.
and not exactly, yeah. the process of.
The scientific process.
Yeah.
So again, the conclusion we came to at the end of our talk last week was that Genesis chapter 1, the first page of the Bible, is describing God's ideal vision for actually the whole cosmos, a place where God lives with his partners to rule the world in harmony forever. So if we kind of break that sentence down into 2 points, it's that God created a place where he could exist or be present with humans. And the second part is that we're actually his partners, that God shares his authority. He's not a dictator, or he didn't just throw us the keys and leave. He actually wants to work with us to rule the world in harmony forever. And I thought that's not something we often take a lot of time to explore. And I think that really sets up what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, and I think that, if people go back to the video of that particular Sunday, I thought it was a great analogy that where you're throwing the ball back and forth. And just to sort of like, this is kind of what he means. It's this back and forth sort of thing. And I think it really gives a great idea of what God's intent was in the idea of creation and in that relationship with us. And then everything changes.
Yep, we jump right into the fall. So let's why don't you kick us off there? Let us know what the fall is. And
well, it kind of like in the midst of the creation, God does set up a thing, and it's really, when we look back at it, it's kind of like a one, we'll say kind of like, hey, a relationship, an agreement to kind of in the midst of this, and this is found in chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 16, and he says, the Lord commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day that you eat from it, you will certainly die.
So basically, God has one rule.
Yeah, there seems to be like really one rule in that whole thing, and this is this agreement that happens. And so when you move to chapter 3, we see this character that's described as a serpent, and it creates a question or a doubt in the minds of Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. That question that says, well, you surely won't die. Like
yeah,
that.
If you
come on,
eat it, you won't just die. Yeah.
Yeah, come on, no. Or like the idea of like, well, you know what? Maybe the reason you're not because God doesn't want you to do this because maybe he's holding something back from you. Mm-hmm. That if you just take matters into your own hands, you will really see something more, and he doesn't want you to know that. And it's really interesting. The result of the fall is the lie is basically telling them that, hey, you're going to be something. There's something that God is withholding from you, and basically offering the thing they already really have.
Yeah. To be like God.
And we go back to creation. There is, he made in the image of God. There is, he's sharing authority with you. He's bringing purpose. There's all this thing. And it's sort of like he's tempting with the thing that they already have, which is, I think, such a interesting kind of thing, the way to look at that. And so
it's a very ironic.
It is. And they eat, so they eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as a result, this is sin enters the world, and death being that outcome, and therefore the harmony that God desires is upset.
Right. And I think it's interesting just to note here that, why would God do that kind of thing? And some people, think it's malicious or whatever, or it's a test. And really, it's more about God defining their relationship, and not that he's going to force them to do his will.
No.
Or not that he's going to just let them make all their own decisions. He wants to do it together, but he wants to give them a choice so that they want to do it.
Well, and basically he says, you can go do this, but know that, hey, if you go do this, there are natural consequences.
He didn't trick them. He didn't say, aha, gotcha. Now this bad stuff's going to happen. He warned them. He told them what was going to happen. So I think we can see that God is both fair and just in what happened. Yep. And that, sometimes that part of it is hard for us to grasp, but like you said, because of it, the harmony with God is upset, and the result is death.
Yeah, and I think it's really great because I think we can say like, hey, what does that mean? Like they didn't initially die. They didn't die right away or anything
Yeah.
like that. But Jeff Vanderstelt in his book Gospel Fluency actually talks about there being three deaths that sort of happened in that at that point. There's the spiritual death in that Adam and Eve look elsewhere for their identity, their purpose, authority, truth.
Yeah.
So essentially they, whatever, they decide to, keep the ball that's being thrown to them or look for their own. Like all that sort of, and they look away from the giver of life. There's the physical death, which is, like, okay, there is first the next story is of Cain and Abel, and it's Cain killing Abel because of jealousy.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting to me. The physical death doesn't happen immediately, so it happens in the next story, like you say, through an actual murder, which is the outcome of their separation. But the idea that man was created from the soil or the dirt, so he's already got a mortality built into him. But being in God's presence and eating from the tree of life, which is in the garden, he then has life that goes on forever. But now that the relationship is destroyed and we no longer have access to the tree of life, now nature takes its course and we now die. It wasn't like a poison apple where they
Immediately
died from it. It's because they know the relationship with God was upset and they no longer have access to the giver of the life. So
that's right. And then, like, really, just one more quick thing on the physical death. In the moment, something did die because there were, God covered their nakedness with animal skin, and so there's an animal innocent in this whole thing, and there's a death in there. And so there's those two things. But and much of those things are important. We do want to take more time to talk about the third death, which is relational death.
Yep.
And
that's the big one.
Yeah, that's a really big one. And it kind of reminded me of this moment. Like there's a game called Batman. There's the Telltale series, and it's an adaptive game, and the story changes with the choices you make. Okay. So you have an exchange with someone, and then the game will give you a prompt and how you would like to respond in this moment, and you can there's, I don't know, 3 or 4 prompts. You can do something. It can be mean. It can be somewhere kind of in the middle. You can side with certain characters. You can be gracious, and obviously, depending upon the response you have, their response or whatever will change as well. And sometimes the response you choose will be quite significant, and so as the Batman, the character is interacting with another one, either positive or negatively, on the top left-hand corner, it'll say your relationship with Commissioner Gordon or whoever has changed. Mm-hmm. And I think what happens is in that moment, it was like if this was if there could have a game thing up there, it was like your relation with Adam and Eve, humanity, your relationship with God has changed.
Yep.
And I think that's kind of this really big point right here. It's changed because sin is something that really keeps us from God's presence. And one of the key points of a relationship really is presence.
Right. And that reminds me of one of the Bible Project videos where Tim Mackey explains that God's holiness is not anger towards sin. It's just that his holiness and energy is so pure that to be sinful in his presence would actually be dangerous to you.
Yeah.
And so the sin actually keeps us away from God's presence for our own safety. And so I think let's just take a few minutes and explore this relational change.
Yeah, so I think what happens when we see that with God, that when that, again, your relationship with God has changed, it actually affects every other relationship. It affected the relationship with the land, which, if we take that moment to look at it, it's now going to be hard work to produce.
And let's also remember that was their job. Their life, they had purpose. They were to maintain the earth and to expand the garden. That was their job. And now, because of their destroyed relationship with God, this is going to take hard work. And we know what hard work it is You talk to any farmer, it's hard work.
Yeah, it is work, and so there's that relationship change with the land. Then there was a relationship change between Adam and Eve, and like one of the, when God questions them about eating the fruit, Adam blames Eve. Yeah, so like Eve blames the serpent. So like there's this whole thing, and selfishness comes in, and self-preservation comes in, and the idea is that really at the core of a lot of selfishness, evil is there. And it becomes, again, and when we're talking about, again, we want to be careful we're not talking about self-care and things like that. Well, selfishness is really about promoting yourself at the expense of
Others,
other people, like oppression, whatever it might be, like that's it. And so it affects that relationship, and then of course it reflects the relationship with God. It affects this place, Eden, where heaven meets earth, place where the presence and relationship happens. Relationships all around are strained. It becomes more about self-fulfillment. It becomes more about power grabs, and it doesn't really become how we serve one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that comes from just the idea of deciding what is right and wrong for ourselves. So what I decide is right for me might be taking advantage of you. I want what you have, so I think it's right for me to have that, so I just take it. And obviously that's not right for you. So I'm not looking out from the other person's perspective. It becomes very self-centered and selfish, like we just talked about. And I think that relates back to that choice of wanting to decide what's right and what's wrong for ourselves.
That's right. Yeah, and so when this kind of exists in us, this relational breakdown, when it exists in us personally, it's going to find its way into our systems and structures.
And the community, yeah.
Yeah, it's not only going to affect individual relationships, but it affects relationships between groups, cultures, races. And I think, we've seen and are seeing a lot of the fruit of that. The fall is broken relationship structures, wherever that looks like, between God, between even ourselves, just internally, and others.
Yep. So then we get slavery, racism, prejudice, all those things come.
All of those
from
things.
These broken relationships,
Yeah. What God set up in creation was rejected, and he, in the case of Adam, he graciously gave what, kind of what they ultimately wanted.
Yeah.
And then it's a breakdown. And again, it's with all created because it's all connected. And I think go ahead.
Oh, I just think that's the point we don't often realize. We have this idea that I can do whatever I want, and as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. But you can't really do whatever you want and not hurt anybody else.
Yeah, I think it's very likely going to happen, or could happen. And I think like when we even to really understand this all kind of connected idea of relationship, when God sets up a covenant with Israel, with between Moses and Israel, and when he has those commandments, it starts off with the 10 Commandments, and then 633. I hope I got that right. 13. Probably, I don't know. Like so many of them are actually about relational issues and fixes, between the Israelites and God, Israelites and themselves, Israelites and the people who are not Israelites. Leviticus 19 actually says, do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them as native-born Israelites. Love them as you love yourselves. And there's that whole thing. And then even moving on to Jesus, when answering what is the greatest commandment, he, says love God, and just as importantly, love others as yourself.
Yeah.
It's all connected. It's not just importantly, just as important as the first one. It's love others. And so there's this relational thing. It's all interconnected.
And there's the spoiler, I guess, if we're giving away spoilers,
that's right.
Is Jesus came back to restore our relationship back to God.
That's right.
It's all connected.
And so fall is really, if we're going to, one of the big things about the fall is its relationships in all areas becoming fractured.
So in the next few episodes and in-person gatherings we have, we're going to be exploring some of the covenants and relationships that are discussed in the Old Testament part of the Bible narrative, and we're going to explore those fractured relationships. But at the same time, we see sort of splashes of hope and
Yeah.
sort of a foreshadowing of the solution that God is going to present to the humanity throughout. And I think that's we see the some of the terrible things that have happened because of the fractured relationships, but there's never a time where we don't have hope. So those are the things we want to look at through the next few weeks as we look at more closely at the fall.
Right. Yeah. So if again, if you're just sort of jumping into in this conversation, and you wonder, hey, we talked about creation a little bit at the beginning, but moving to the fall, please go back to the video from the week before that. That just with Pastor Ron talking about the creation to again get more context. And if you just take more time with this, we're going to have some questions. They'll be linked in the show notes, and they just continue these conversations and maybe just some enlightening about this whole idea of the story of God. And so take some time to do that. Do that with some friends. Do that with your missional community group. Do that with your partner. And please, this more growing in this understanding, and we will get to the hope. We will get to the hope in this whole story. Have a great time.